You're in my seat. 5 simple words, spoken in a police break room at 7:18 on a gray Monday morning. We're about to expose everything wrong with the Ravenwood Police Department. The room itself looked ordinary, almost forgettable. A humming soda machine in the corner. A microwave with someone's old coffee stain beneath the handle. A bulletin board crowded with shift schedules, union notices, and faded community outreach flyers no one had touched in months. Outside the narrow window, rain tapped softly against the glass, turning the parking lot lights into long yellow streaks across the pavement. Inside, 6 officers moved through the morning routine with the tired silence of people who had learned which conversations were safe and which ones could ruin your career. At the small table near the window sat a black man in a dark jacket, calm, still, one hand resting beside a closed leather folder. His name was Marcus Ellison, though no one in that room had bothered to ask. He had arrived 20 minutes earlier, nodded politely to the desk sergeant, poured himself a black coffee, and taken the only open chair. He did not announce himself. He did not flash a badge. He simply sat there, reading the room the way experienced officers read a street corner before stepping out of the cruiser. The silence changed when Officer Blake Reynolds walked in. Blake was tall, broad-shouldered, white, and carried himself like the building owed him rent. 17 years on the force had given him confidence, but not wisdom. The younger officers watched him the way people watch a storm cloud move across a county road, hoping it passes without choosing them. He stopped 3 feet from Marcus, looked down at the chair, then at Marcus's face, and gave a short laugh that made 2 officers near the coffee maker lower their eyes. "You're in my seat," Blake said. Marcus looked up slowly, not startled, not offended in the way Blake expected, just present. "I didn't see a name on it," Marcus replied, his voice even, almost gentle. The room tightened. Officer Kyle Mercer smirked from beside the lockers, and Ryan Holt leaned back against the counter like he had already decided which side he was on. Blake stepped closer, his smile hardening. "That's because people around here know better." No one laughed this time, but no one objected either. That was the real sickness in the room, not just one man's arrogance, but the quiet agreement surrounding it. Imagine standing there, wearing the same profession, breathing the same stale coffee air, knowing the insult is wrong, and still watching everyone pretend it is normal. Marcus placed his coffee down carefully. There was no anger in the movement, no drama, only control. Blake glanced at the folder on the table. He did not know what was inside. He did not know that his name was printed on the first page. He did not know that 3 suspension orders had already been signed before sunrise. And he had no idea that the man he was trying to humiliate was the one who signed them. Marcus did not move from the chair, and that irritated Blake more than any argument could have. In Blake Reynolds' world, people moved when he wanted them to move. New recruits moved. Dispatchers moved. Civilians moved. Young officers with quiet voices and nervous smiles moved before he even had to ask. For years, the Ravenwood Police Department had allowed him to mistake fear for respect, and that mistake had grown roots deep enough to split the foundation. The department sat in a brick municipal building on the east side of Ravenwood, Ohio, just off Route 42, where the courthouse, city hall, and police headquarters formed a triangle of authority that looked solid from the outside. But inside, the cracks were everywhere. They lived in missing complaint forms, in body camera reviews that always seemed to stop 1 minute too early, in citizens who stopped reporting misconduct because nothing ever changed, and in good officers who learned to keep their heads down if they wanted to keep their schedules clean. 3 months earlier, the city council had received a stack of letters from residents, church leaders, former officers, and 2 civil rights attorneys. None of the letters used dramatic language. That was what made them harder to ignore. They described traffic stops that felt different depending on who was behind the wheel. They described young black men being spoken to like suspects before anyone asked their names. They described Latino families treated like visitors in their own neighborhoods. They described women officers being talked over, younger officers being mocked, and black officers being forced to prove twice what others were simply allowed to be. The mayor had called it a personnel concern. The city attorney had called it a liability. But Marcus Ellison had called it what it was, a culture problem. Not one bad moment. Not one bad apple. A room where everyone knows what is happening and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. That was why he had come without ceremony. No press conference. No uniformed escort. No public announcement that the Deputy Commissioner for Professional Standards was walking into Ravenwood to conduct a final review. Marcus knew uniforms could change behavior the same way cameras could change voices. He wanted to see the department before it had time to perform for him. He wanted to hear what people said when they thought power was not listening. And now, sitting in that break room with rain tracing crooked lines down the window, he had heard enough to understand the silence. Officer Daniel Price stood near the bulletin board, 26 years old, fresh out of field training, his hands wrapped around a paper cup he had not sipped from. He looked from Blake to Marcus, then to Kyle and Ryan, and something uneasy moved across his face. Daniel had joined the force because he believed the badge meant service. But lately, he had been learning that belief alone did not protect anyone. Marcus noticed him. Blake noticed him too. "Something funny, Price?" Blake asked without turning fully around. Daniel swallowed. "No, sir." Blake smiled, satisfied. Marcus watched that exchange carefully, because sometimes the future of a department is not decided by the loudest man in the room, but by the quietest one deciding whether to stay silent. Marcus Ellison had not always worked behind a desk, reviewing files and signing orders with the steady hand of a man who understood the weight of every page. Before the titles, before the city meetings, before attorneys used careful language around him, he had been a patrol officer on the west side of Cleveland, answering calls in neighborhoods where trust was thin and fear often arrived before the cruiser did. He knew what it meant to step into a living room where a mother was crying, a teenager was angry, and everyone expected the badge to make things worse instead of better. He knew what it meant to lower his voice when others raised theirs. He knew what it meant to listen long enough for someone to believe they were still human. That was how Marcus had earned respect, not by demanding it, not by leaning on rank, but by becoming the kind of officer people remembered for the right reasons. Yet, even in uniform, even with commendations in his file and years of clean service behind him, there had always been moments that reminded him how quickly his dignity could be questioned. A store clerk following him 2 aisles too long after his shift. A driver staring at him in disbelief when he stepped out of the patrol car as the senior officer. A fellow officer once telling him, with a smile meant to make the insult sound harmless, that he was surprisingly articulate. Marcus had learned early that racism did not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrived politely. Sometimes it wore a friendly face. Sometimes it called itself tradition, humor, or the way things had always been. That was why he had accepted the professional standards appointment when most people told him it would make him enemies. He did not want enemies. He wanted a department worthy of the people it served. He wanted young officers to understand that courage was not just what happened during danger. Courage was telling the truth in a room where lies were comfortable. In Ravenwood, that truth had been buried under years of habit. Complaints from citizens had been labeled attitude problems. Concerns from black officers had been called oversensitivity. Witness statements had been questioned more harshly when the witness came from the wrong zip code. And men like Blake Reynolds had learned to survive inside that system by making themselves useful to the wrong people. High arrest numbers, loud confidence, a reputation for control. To some supervisors, that had been enough. To Marcus, it was not even close. He had read Blake's file twice the night before, sitting at his kitchen table beneath the soft light over the sink while his wife, Angela, slept upstairs. He had read the complaint from a high school teacher stopped 3 blocks from his own home. He had read the statement from a former officer who resigned after months of mockery disguised as locker room humor. He had read Daniel Price's and signed memo, never submitted, saved in a draft folder on an internal server. That one stayed with him. Not because it was the most dramatic, but because it sounded like a young man trying not to lose his conscience. Now Daniel stood 10 feet away from him, staring into his untouched coffee while Blake Reynolds waited for Marcus to shrink. Marcus looked at the young officer and saw the question hanging over him. What kind of officer are you going to become when the room gets quiet? Blake Reynolds mistook Marcus's silence for weakness, the way men like him often did. He leaned one hand against the table, close enough for everyone to feel the pressure without anything needing to happen. The break room seemed smaller now. The rain kept tapping the window. The soda machine hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. Nobody moved toward it. Nobody wanted to leave and miss what Blake might do next, but nobody wanted to stay and be responsible for what they were seeing either. Marcus looked at Blake's hand on the table, then back at his face. Officer Reynolds, he said calmly, using the name on the badge clipped to Blake's uniform. Is there a department policy assigning seats in this room? Kyle Mercer let out a short laugh, the kind meant to help Blake but protect himself. Man, he talks like a lawyer. Ryan Holt smiled into his coffee. Blake did not smile. You knew people always come in here with policy words, he said. Policy this, procedure that. Out on the street, we deal with reality. Marcus nodded once, as if he were taking notes without writing anything down. Reality matters, he said. So does conduct. That word changed the air. Conduct. It was too formal for a break room argument. Too clean. Too close to a file. Daniel Price noticed it first. His eyes flicked toward the leather folder on the table again, the one Marcus had kept closed since Blake walked in. At the edge of the folder, barely visible beneath Marcus's palm, Daniel could see a white label with the words Professional Standards Division. His stomach tightened. He had seen those words in training videos, in policy manuals, in emails no one wanted to receive. Blake saw Daniel looking and followed his gaze. For a second, something uncertain passed over his face. Then pride covered it like a curtain. What is that? Blake asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. He lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The pause bothered Blake more than any insult could have. I asked you a question, Blake said. And I heard it, Marcus replied. Carl stepped away from the lockers, trying to sound casual. Maybe the guy is from City Hall. You know, one of those consultants they keep hiring to tell cops how to do police work. Ryan chuckled. Would not surprise me. Blake looked Marcus over again, this time with sharper suspicion. Is that what you are? Some City Hall observer. Marcus folded his hands on the table. I am here to observe, yes. Blake leaned back and laughed, but the laugh had lost its comfort. Then observe this. This room has a way of working. People earn their place here. They do not just walk in and take it. Marcus's eyes stayed steady. And how does someone earn a place here? Blake's jaw tightened. By proving they belong. The words landed exactly where he intended them to land, but Marcus did not flinch. Across the room, Daniel lowered his cup. He remembered his first week, when Blake had told him the same thing with a grin. Prove you belong. Back then, Daniel thought it meant courage. Now he was beginning to understand it often meant obedience. Marcus looked around the room, not accusing anyone, not rescuing anyone from their own conscience. That is a dangerous standard, he said softly. Especially when the people judging who belongs have already made up their minds. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Blake's face hardened. You calling me biased? Marcus looked at him for a long second. I am asking whether you know the difference between respect and control. No one breathed for a moment. Daniel stared at Marcus as if someone had finally said aloud what had been living in the walls for years. Blake stepped back from the table, his pride wounded, but his voice still loud. You do not know anything about this department. Marcus glanced at the folder. I know more than you think. Blake's eyes dropped to the leather folder, and for the first time that morning, his confidence showed a thin crack. It lasted less than a second, but Marcus saw it. So did Daniel. Men like Blake understood files. They understood paper trails, complaint numbers, timestamps, signatures, and the quiet danger of a document that had traveled farther than they expected. Blake reached for the folder with a quick motion, not aggressive enough to be called force, but entitled enough to tell the truth about him. Marcus placed one hand over it before Blake could touch the cover. The movement was small, calm, final. That is not yours, Marcus said. Blake stared at Marcus's hand as if the refusal itself offended him. This is my department, he said. Nothing in this building is above review. Marcus did not raise his voice. You are right about that. Kyle stopped smiling. Ryan looked toward the door, suddenly interested in whether anyone else was coming. Daniel felt his pulse in his throat. He had seen Blake talk down to civilians before, had seen him turn routine questions into little contests of dominance, had seen him walk away laughing while someone else stood there embarrassed and silent. But this was different. Marcus was not embarrassed. Marcus was waiting. That waiting made Blake look smaller by the second. You know what your problem is? Blake said, pointing toward the chair, but aiming at something deeper. You come in here acting like you already know us. You sit in a room you have never earned, looking at everybody like we are the ones on trial. Marcus looked around at the other officers. Are you? The question was soft, but it cut through the room sharper than a shout. No one answered. The break room clock clicked forward to 7:26. The morning shift would begin in 4 minutes. Cars would roll out. Reports would be filed. Calls would come through. To the public, Ravenwood Police Department would look like another ordinary agency, beginning another ordinary day. But inside that break room, a different kind of call had arrived, and everyone could hear it. Blake leaned closer, trying to reclaim the room with volume. "You people always think the system is against you," he said. "Maybe some folks just do not like being told they are wrong every time they open their mouth." The words landed heavily, not because they were new, but because they were familiar. Marcus had heard cleaner versions in boardrooms and rougher versions on sidewalks. He had heard them whispered after promotions, hidden inside jokes, dressed up as concerns about fit, tone, attitude, and culture. He let the silence hold them long enough for everyone to understand exactly what had been said. Then he asked, "When you say you people, who are you talking about?" Blake blinked. Kyle looked down. Ryan's face went blank. Daniel's grip tightened around his paper cup until the rim bent inward. That was the moment when the room could no longer pretend this was about a chair. Blake tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Do not twist my words." Marcus leaned back slightly. "I am not twisting them. I am giving you a chance to explain them." No one rescued Blake. Not even Kyle. Not even Ryan. For years, Blake had counted on noise, on jokes, on people rushing to smooth the edges of what he said. But Marcus offered no noise. Only space. Space for the truth to stand there exposed. Blake's face reddened, and pride made the choice for him. He grabbed the edge of the folder and pulled it across the table before Marcus could stop him this time. Papers shifted inside. A corner slipped loose. On the top page, in black letters, were 3 names: Blake Reynolds, Kyle Mercer, Ryan Holt. Beneath them were the words "Final Administrative Action Pending Service." Blake stared at the page. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Marcus looked at the folder, then back at him. "That," he said quietly, "is why conduct matters." For one frozen second, the break room belonged to the paper. Not to Blake's voice, not to his years of swagger, not to the badge on his chest or the fear he had trained into younger officers one comment at a time. Just the paper. 3 names. 3 case numbers. 3 histories that had finally reached the end of excuses. Blake looked down at the page as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous. Kyle Mercer stepped closer, then stopped when he saw his own name printed beneath Blake's. Ryan Holt set his coffee on the counter so carefully it barely made a sound. No one laughed now. No one called it a joke. The room had become too honest for that. Marcus did not take the folder back. He let Blake hold it, because sometimes the truth is heavier when it rests in the hands of the person who tried to bury it. "What is this?" Blake asked, but his voice had changed. The hard edges were still there, but something uncertain moved beneath them. Marcus answered plainly. "Administrative suspension notices. Pending formal service by command staff and city council." Blake looked up fast. "You do not have authority to do that." Marcus held his eyes. "No. The Deputy Commissioner for Professional Standards does." Daniel Price's head lifted. The title moved through the room before anyone repeated it. Silent, but powerful, like a door opening somewhere far away. Blake's face tightened. He searched Marcus's clothes, his jacket, his hands, as though a title that large should have announced itself with medals, gold trim, or a louder entrance. But Marcus had come in like any other man, and that was the part Blake could not forgive. He had judged him before he knew him. He had measured him before he heard him. He had decided where Marcus belonged before Marcus ever spoke. "You are lying," Blake said, but the sentence did not stand up straight. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and removed a slim identification wallet. He opened it on the table with the same quiet care he had used with his coffee. The badge was there. The city seal was there. His name was there. Marcus Ellison, Deputy Commissioner, Professional Standards Division. The room seemed to lose its air. Kyle whispered something under his breath and stepped back. Ryan stared at the floor. Daniel looked from the identification to Marcus, then to the folder, and the pieces came together with painful clarity. The man Blake had mocked was not there to take a chair. He was there because the department had run out of chances. Blake tried to recover. "This is a setup." Marcus closed the identification wallet. "No. A setup creates behavior. Accountability records it." The sentence landed quietly, but it landed everywhere. Blake swallowed. "You came in here pretending to be nobody." Marcus's expression did not change. "I came in here without announcing my rank. There is a difference." Down the hallway, Footsteps approached, steady and official. The break room door had been left half open, and through the gap came the sound of polished shoes on linoleum, a radio clicking once, and a woman's voice giving calm instructions to someone outside. Captain Helen Brooks appeared in the doorway with the city attorney beside her and a human resources representative carrying a sealed envelope. Helen Brooks was in her late 50s, white, composed, and known for wasting no words when the truth was already obvious. Her eyes moved across the room, from Blake's hand on the folder to Kyle's pale face to Ryan's standing stiff by the counter. Then she looked at Marcus and gave a respectful nod. "Deputy Commissioner Ellison," she said, "we are ready to proceed." That was the reveal Blake could not talk over. Not rumor, not opinion, not politics. A captain had said it out loud in front of everyone. Marcus stood slowly from the chair, not because Blake had demanded it, but because the moment had arrived on its own terms. He buttoned his jacket and picked up the folder from the table. Blake's fingers loosened without protest. For the first time all morning, he was the one who did not know where to stand. Captain Brooks did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Authority, when it is real, does not have to fill the room by force. It simply arrives, and everything false begins to collapse around it. The city attorney, a narrow-faced man named Paul Whitaker, stepped beside her with a folder stamped Confidential Administrative Review. Behind him, the Human Resources representative, Denise Carver, held 3 sealed envelopes against her chest. The same officers who had looked away minutes earlier now stood perfectly still, their eyes moving from Marcus to Blake to the documents, as if watching a lesson they should have learned years ago. Marcus placed the leather folder on the table and opened it fully for the first time. The top page was not dramatic. It was not written in anger. It was clean, official, and almost painfully ordinary. Names, dates, badge numbers, complaint references, policy citations. That was what made it frightening. It did not need emotion to be true. Blake stared at the pages, his face tight with disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he said, but the words sounded smaller than he meant them to. "I have served this city for 17 years. Marcus nodded once. "Your years of service are listed." Blake pointed toward the folder. "Then you know what I have done for this department." Marcus turned one page. "I know what residents reported. I know what officers witnessed. I know what supervisors ignored. I know what was dismissed as humor, attitude, pressure, field judgment, and tradition." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence did not protect Blake. It surrounded him. Paul Whitaker cleared his throat. "Officer Reynolds, Officer Mercer, Officer Holt. As of this morning, you are being placed on administrative suspension pending the final outcome of the internal investigation and civil review process." Denise stepped forward and placed the envelopes on the table one at a time. Each soft tap sounded louder than it should have. Blake looked at the envelopes as though they were something impossible. "You cannot do this in front of everybody." Captain Brooks answered before Marcus could. "You created the setting, Officer Reynolds." That sentence moved through the room like a cold wind. Kyle looked shaken. Ryan swallowed and kept his eyes down. Blake's pride fought for one more doorway out. "This is because of what I said just now? That was nothing. People joke around in here. Everybody knows that." Marcus looked at the younger officers near the wall, then at Daniel Price. Everybody knowing something does not make it harmless. Daniel's face changed. For months, he had told himself the same lie Blake was using now. It was just the way the room worked. Just the way older officers talked. Just the price of fitting in. But standing there, hearing it spoken by the man responsible for it, Daniel finally understood how many bad things survive because decent people call them normal. Marcus turned back to Blake. This morning was not the cause. It was confirmation. Blake's eyes narrowed. Confirmation of what? Marcus lifted a printed summary from the file. A pattern. The word was simple, but it carried every complaint, every ignored memo, every quiet resignation, every resident who had gone home feeling smaller after meeting someone with a badge. Marcus did not read the details aloud. He did not humiliate anyone for entertainment. That was the difference between accountability and revenge. Instead, he closed the folder halfway and said, "You were trusted with public authority. That trust comes with limits. When those limits are treated like suggestions, someone eventually has to answer." Blake looked around for support. Kyle would not meet his eyes. Ryan said nothing. Captain Brooks stood firm. Paul Whitaker waited. Denise Carver held her pen ready. and Daniel Price, the youngest man in the room, finally set his damaged paper cup on the counter and stepped away from the wall. Daniel Price did not step forward quickly. It was not the kind of courage that arrives like thunder. It came slowly, painfully, the way honest things often do when they have been buried under fear for too long. He moved away from the wall with his shoulders tense and his face pale, and every eye in the break room turned toward him. Blake saw him and tried to smile, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "Careful, rookie," Blake said, forcing a light tone that fooled no one. "You do not want to misunderstand what is happening here." Daniel looked at the floor for a second, then lifted his head. "I understand better than I did yesterday." The words were quiet, but they carried. Marcus watched him without interrupting. Captain Brooks folded her hands in front of her. Paul Whitaker clicked his pen once, then stopped. Daniel took a breath that seemed to pass through his whole body. "I wrote the memo," he said. Kyle's head snapped toward him. Ryan closed his eyes. Blake's face hardened. "What memo?" Daniel looked at Marcus now. "The unsigned memo in the internal server. The one about the break room comments, the traffic stop jokes, the way complaints got talked about before they were even reviewed." His voice shook, but it did not break. "I did not submit it. I saved it and walked away because I was afraid." No one spoke. The soda machine hummed on as if nothing historic was happening 2 feet away from it. Daniel turned toward the other officers, the ones who had looked down, looked away, pretended to check their phones, pretended silence was neutral. "I told myself it was not my place. I told myself I was new. I told myself maybe I was being too sensitive because that is what people say when they do not want to deal with what is right in front of them." Blake shook his head. "You are making a mistake." Daniel looked at him directly. "No, sir. I made the mistake before. This is me correcting it." The room seemed to shift, not dramatically, not like a movie where everyone suddenly becomes brave, but in a real way, a human way. One officer near the coffee maker lowered his head. Another looked toward Marcus with something like shame in his eyes. Marcus knew this moment mattered more than the envelopes on the table. Suspensions could remove 3 officers from duty, but only truth could begin removing the fear they left behind. Blake's voice dropped. "After everything I taught you?" Daniel's answer came slowly. "You taught me what kind of officer I do not want to become." That sentence landed harder than anger ever could. Blake looked around for someone to challenge it, but the room had changed its allegiance. Not to Marcus, not to the city attorney, to the truth. Marcus opened the folder again and removed a small printed still image from the break room security camera, taken only minutes earlier. It showed Blake leaning over the table, Kyle smiling, Ryan watching, Daniel frozen near the bulletin board, and Marcus seated calmly beneath the window. "This morning was recorded," Marcus said. "Not because anyone wanted a performance, but because common areas in this building are monitored for safety and policy compliance." Blake's expression fell. Marcus placed the image beside the envelopes. "But the camera is not the most important witness in this room." He looked at Daniel, then at the others. "People are." Captain Brooks nodded once, her face heavy with the kind of regret leaders carry when they know a problem grew on their watch. "This department will cooperate fully with the review," she said. "And it starts today." For the first time since Marcus arrived, no one argued. Blake Reynolds did not argue when Denise Carver slid the first envelope toward him. That may have been the clearest sign that the morning had finally reached him. Not changed him, not yet, but reached him. His hands stayed at his sides, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the paper as if refusing to touch it might stop it from being real. Kyle Mercer accepted his envelope with a trembling nod. Ryan Holt took his without looking at anyone. Captain Brooks instructed them to surrender their department identification cards and service equipment according to policy, and for once, the process moved without sarcasm, without laughter, without the easy cruelty that had filled the room only minutes earlier. There was no celebration in Marcus's face, no smile, no victory lap. He had never come to Ravenwood to enjoy watching men fall. He had come because too many people had already been made to feel small inside a building that was supposed to stand for public trust. As the 3 suspended officers were escorted from the break room to begin the administrative process, Blake paused at the doorway. For a moment, he looked back at the chair by the window, the same chair that had seemed so important when he walked in, the same chair he had used as a symbol of ownership, seniority, territory, and control. Now it was just a chair, gray vinyl, metal legs, one small tear near the edge of the cushion. Nothing more. Marcus saw him looking at it, but said, nothing. Some lessons need silence around them. When Blake disappeared into the hallway, the room remained still. No one knew what to do with the quiet after the bully was gone. It felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like fresh air entering a place that had been closed too long. Daniel Price stood near the counter, his eyes red with the strain of finally speaking. I should have said something sooner, he said. Marcus turned toward him. Maybe, he answered. Daniel looked down, ashamed. Marcus softened his voice. But you said something today? Now make sure today is not the last time. Daniel nodded slowly, and something in him seemed to settle. Not relief exactly. Responsibility. Captain Brooks looked around the break room at the remaining officers. This review is not over, she said. But neither is this department. What happens next depends on whether we choose protection of each other's comfort or protection of the public's trust. No one rushed to respond. That was all right. Real change rarely begins with a speech. It begins with one person refusing to laugh. One person refusing to look away. One person telling the truth before it becomes easy. Marcus gathered the documents and closed the leather folder. The rain outside had softened to a mist, leaving the parking lot shining under the morning light. The first patrol units were still waiting, lined up in neat rows, their doors marked with the words to serve and protect. Marcus looked at those words through the window for a long moment. They were simple words, printed on thousands of vehicles across America, but they only meant something when the people wearing the badge lived by them in rooms where no citizens were watching. Before he left, Daniel reached for the chair by the window and pulled it back slightly. Deputy Commissioner, he said, you can sit here if you want. Marcus looked at the chair, then at Daniel, then at every officer still standing in the room. A good officer does not protect his seat, he said. He protects people. Then he walked out into the hallway, carrying the folder under one arm, not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as proof that dignity can be defended without cruelty. And justice can arrive without raising its voice. Blake had thought power lived in a chair. Marcus knew better. Power was never in the seat. It was in the courage to stand up.